Hi everyone, it's Claire again. Welcome back to the Curious Kitchen. Today we're making pumpkin spice custard buns. So these buns are a twist on the classic egg custard buns, or naihuangbao as they're called in Mandarin. So these come from southern China. They have a really creamy egg custard wrapped in a fluffy steamed bun. And you can probably find them at dim sum restaurants or in the frozen aisle of like an Asian supermarket. So for today's version, I added some pumpkin puree and fall spices into both the custard filling and the bun to create a pumpkin spice version. So today for this video, we're gonna focus on the custard part. Now, the scariest part of making any custard comes from the eggs. I always kind of pray to the custard powers above and hope that they don't scramble. But to better understand our techniques for making a really smooth custard, let's talk a little bit more about eggs and why they do sometimes scramble. So here in a raw egg white, what we would find are proteins, kind of just floating around in water. But if we take a closer look at each protein, what we'll see is that they're essentially strings of beads. So scientists call these beads amino acids. There's like 20 some of them, but there's a lot of rules for amino acids about which ones like to touch and which ones don't. So on here, I just have a couple different beads, and let's say these white ones really like to touch and the colored ones don't like the white ones. So to fulfill these rules, we might have these guys touch and this colored one move as far away as possible. And because of these amino acid interactions, our protein string folds into a three-dimensional shape. Now, depending on the order of the amino acids, we might get somewhat different shapes. I have a white one here and here on this protein string. So there's a loop, and here's a colored one that goes as far away as possible. So in an egg white, these protein strings end up getting folded into little balls, essentially, that are just floating around. And the reason egg whites are translucent is because there's so much space in between these proteins for light to pass through. Now, when we heat an egg, when we fry an egg, for example, the heat actually breaks the bonds between the amino acids. So, these two, if they were stuck together earlier, they separate. But they still really want a buddy to stick to. And what happens when we cook an egg is all of these proteins are unraveling and they're finding new buddies with each other. And so in an egg white, which has more than two proteins, we get a lot of these proteins kind of clumping together. And the more we cook the egg, the closer they come. They squeeze out water from between them. And that's why the longer we cook an egg, the tougher and the more rubbery it gets, because all of these proteins are stuck together. And it's also dry because it's losing water. Now, in a custard, there's usually a lot of extra liquid, like mostly in the form of milk. So these proteins in a smooth custard end up further apart from each other, and there's a lot of liquid in between. Now what happens when a custard scrambles is that these proteins unravel, and then they get nervous, they really want to find a buddy, and they find one and they stick together. And in this case, the proteins kind of clump together. So you have clumps of curds, essentially, floating in the rest of the watery liquid that doesn't have any protein left in it. So the way we keep a custard smooth without clumping is by making sure that as these proteins unravel, they don't stick together. So we have two main strategies for doing this. One is by slowing down this unraveling process, and the other is to keep the proteins separate once they have unraveled. So we have a couple of ways to slow the proteins from unraveling. So one is called tempering. It's a process where you're going to see it. We're going to heat up the milk and pour the hot milk into the eggs. And this raises the temperature of the eggs very, very gently, just a little bit at a time. And that means that the proteins are unraveling more slowly. And we're also whisking a lot in the process to make sure that the heat is distributed evenly and that the unraveling proteins are moving away from each other. Now, this custard also contains sugar, and sugar actually also helps with this process because sugar loves water. Like we might have talked about with the apple pie, it'll grab all the water to itself and away from the proteins. And with less water, it's harder for the proteins to unravel and move around. So the sugar actually also slows down the unraveling process. Now, we also have two strategies for keeping the unraveled proteins further apart from each other. So one is just mixing and making sure to move them away from each other as quickly as we can. But the other is actually the cornstarch. So starch, when it absorbs hot liquid, swells to many times its original size, and it essentially provides a physical obstacle between the proteins so they can't really reach across the space and connect with each other. All right, so let's head back into the kitchen and see it in action. All right, so let's go over our ingredients quickly. So, of course, I have the eggs, which we just talked about. I also have my cornstarch and sugar combined in this bowl. I'm eventually going to mix it with the eggs, but because the sugar draws water from the egg, it kind of makes the texture of the eggs kind of strange if you leave them together for too long. So I'm going to whisk them together as I'm going to heat the milk later. Of course, I have my pumpkin puree and all of my spices. And finally, we have our milk with some sugar in it. So I divided the sugar just because with all the cornstarch, I didn't want the egg mixture to become too thick, so I put the rest of the sugar in with the milk. All right, so I'm just gonna start by heating this milk over medium heat. I'm letting the sugar dissolve, and I want to heat it until I start to see little bubbles around the sides of the pot. Now we're gonna pour the milk very slowly and whisk constantly so that we don't cook the eggs. All right, now I'm just gonna pour everything back into the pot and return it to the heat so that the egg can completely cook through and the cornstarch can thicken. So I'm gonna stir this constantly still to make sure that the heat is evenly distributed and that the cornstarch doesn't really clump up as we cook it. So the other thing that's happening right now is this liquid is getting even hotter and the cornstarch is absorbing even more water, and that's going to do a lot for the thickness of the custard. We're just going to let this go until it thickens. We want to make sure the cornstarch cooks completely so that it doesn't continue to thicken the custard while the buns steam. And I'll show you this later, but we also really want this custard to get to a nice boil because then we know that we've deactivated enzymes in the egg yolks called amylases, which would otherwise just chew up all the starch that we are thickening with and make our custard thin. All right, I just took the custard off the heat. It's fairly thick, but we're going to be adding a lot of pumpkin to it. And we want it to stay pretty thick so that it's easier to fill our buns. So I'm just going to add all of my pumpkin and my spices. You want to do this while the custard is still warm because we don't want to whisk it or agitate it too much after it cools. So as it cools, the starch is going to kind of move into the structure that's going to keep the filling thick. And if we whisk it after that, we're going to disrupt the structure and thin the custard a little bit. So just whisk everything else in while the custard is still warm and steamy. And here we are, it's basically done. So now you just want to set it aside and let it cool to room temperature as you make the dough, which we will do in next week's episode. If you want, you can also cover this with plastic wrap or something and put it in the fridge for up to 3 days. Just don't freeze it because the cornstarch doesn't hold up to freezing very well. All right, Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week when we put all this pumpkin goodness into more pumpkin goodness. That would be the dough. Bye!